You might want to sit down for this one, because what just happened inside the WNBA isn't being talked about honestly, and the silence around it is louder than any press conference ever could be. Something shifted. Quietly. Strategically. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Stephen A. Smith didn't just rant. He didn't just speculate. He didn't just give one of his usual headline-grabbing takes. What he actually did was far more dangerous for the league. He confirmed a reality that the WNBA has been desperately trying to keep behind closed doors. A reality that changes everything about where women's basketball is headed next. Because this isn't just about contracts or pay raises or labor negotiations. This is about leverage. It's about power. And it's about what happens when the one person driving the entire machine quietly decides she doesn't need to be in the driver's seat anymore. For months, fans were told the league was finally thriving. Ratings were up. Arenas were packed. Sponsors were lining up. Charter flights were secured. The narrative was simple. Women's basketball had arrived, and nothing could stop the momentum. But what if that momentum was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit? Stephen A. Smith essentially dropped a reality bomb that exposed the uncomfortable truth. The league's explosive growth wasn't evenly distributed. It wasn't organic across the board. It was centered around one gravitational force. And when that force stopped engaging the system the way it used to, panic followed. There was no resignation letter. No Instagram post. No emotional goodbye speech. Instead, there was something far more calculated: distance. Silence. And one decision that spoke louder than 1,000 words. And that decision didn't just rattle the WNBA front office. It sent shockwaves through the Players Association, unsettled media partners, and made executives start asking a question they were not prepared to answer. What happens if Caitlin Clark decides she's done playing along? Because while the public argument is about fairness and equity, what's happening behind the scenes looks a lot more like a standoff. And the first domino didn't fall where most people think it did. It started with something insiders are now calling a crash out. And once that happened, everything else became inevitable. The moment that lit the fuse wasn't a hard foul. It wasn't a controversial quote. It wasn't even a media narrative. It was a decision made behind closed doors that most casual fans didn't fully understand. But it may go down as one of the most reckless moves in league history. The WNBA Players Association officially opted out of their collective bargaining agreement 2 years early. In plain terms, they ripped up the contract. No warning. No gradual pressure campaign. No slow build toward negotiations. They pulled the eject handle early, believing the timing gave them maximum leverage. From their perspective, it made sense. The league had never looked stronger on paper. Attendance numbers were exploding. Television ratings were breaking records. Corporate sponsors were finally taking the product seriously. Private charter flights, something players fought for over 2 decades, suddenly became reality. To the union, this looked like the perfect storm. The moment where they could finally demand what they believed they were owed. But Stephen A. Smith pointed out the flaw that almost nobody wanted to say out loud. The league was acting rich before it was actually rich. Yes, growth was real, but profitability was still new, fragile, and heavily dependent on momentum continuing uninterrupted. The Players Association wasn't negotiating with a long-established cash machine. They were negotiating with a business that had only recently started seeing daylight. And here's where the miscalculation became dangerous. The union didn't just opt out quietly. They did it loudly, publicly, with confidence bordering on arrogance. The messaging suggested they believed the league had no choice but to bend, that the fans were now loyal to the product itself. That viewership would remain strong regardless of who was on the floor. They believed the machine could run without its engine. Stephen A. made it brutally clear that assumption was playing with fire. Because the surge in attention didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't evenly spread across teams. It wasn't the result of a perfectly balanced marketing push. It was driven by one phenomenon pulling casual fans into the sport for the first time. Fans who didn't grow up watching the WNBA, who didn't care about legacy debates, and who weren't emotionally invested in union politics. They showed up for one reason. And the union chose to escalate pressure while simultaneously antagonizing the source of that attention. That's the part that turns a negotiation into a self-inflicted wound. Instead of consolidating momentum, the opt-out created instability. Instead of projecting strength, it exposed fear. Fear that the window might be closing faster than expected. fear that if they waited, the hype could cool, ratings could normalize, and leverage would evaporate. But here's the irony Stephen A. highlighted. By threatening disruption, the union risked killing the very momentum they were trying to monetize. Casual fans don't stick around for labor disputes. They don't pick sides in CBA negotiations. They leave. They change the channel. And once they're gone, getting them back is nearly impossible. The opt-out didn't just send a message to the league owners. It sent a message to every star watching closely, especially the one player who didn't actually need the league to survive. And while the union was busy making noise, demanding slices of a pie that had barely finished baking, Caitlin Clark was doing something far more powerful. She was saying nothing. And in the middle of that silence, she made a move that quietly changed the balance of power, a move Stephen A. Smith recognized instantly for what it really was. Because while the union thought they were driving the tank, someone else had already found the eject button. And that's where this story really begins. This is the moment where everything stopped being speculation and started sounding like a warning. Stephen A. Smith didn't frame his comments like gossip. He didn't hide behind hypotheticals. He spoke with the tone of someone who already knew how this story was going to end, and felt obligated to say it out loud before everyone else pretended to be shocked. Because when Stephen A. talks about leverage, he's not guessing. He's watched leagues rise and collapse. He's watched stars save entire sports. And he's watched organizations make the fatal mistake of believing they were bigger than the individual carrying the product. What made his comments hit harder wasn't volume, it was certainty. He wasn't arguing whether Caitlin Clark could walk away. He was explaining why she already had, just not in the way people expected. No resignation paperwork. No formal announcement. No dramatic exit. Instead, Stephen A. framed it as something far more dangerous for the league, a soft resignation. And once that idea landed, everything clicked. Because Caitlin Clark didn't need to threaten anyone. She didn't need to post cryptic messages. She didn't need to demand special treatment. She simply stopped playing the role everyone else needed her to play. Stephen A. made it clear, this wasn't emotional. This wasn't burnout-driven drama. This wasn't a young player overwhelmed by pressure. This was a calculated withdrawal from an ecosystem that no longer served her interests. And that distinction matters. In every labor dispute, there's a hierarchy of pain. The players who need paychecks suffer first. The league suffers next. But the stars with independent wealth, brand power, and optionality, they're insulated. They can wait. They can pivot. They can disappear for a while without losing relevance. Stephen A. pointed out something the union didn't want to confront. Caitlin Clark exists outside the traditional power structure of the WNBA. She doesn't rely on league salary. She doesn't rely on team marketing. She doesn't rely on media favors. And when someone like that stops engaging, it doesn't look loud. It looks quiet, almost polite. But it's devastating. Stephen A.'s tone suggested that Clark had already assessed the situation and made a decision internally. Not about quitting basketball, but about distancing herself from the noise, the politics, and the obligation to carry weight she never asked for. He described it like this wasn't a player being pushed out. It was a player stepping back before the building caught fire. That's why his words landed like confirmation rather than commentary. Because insiders don't talk like that unless they've seen the writing on the wall. Stephen A. emphasized that Clark is the only player in the league with the ability to walk away tomorrow and still win financially, culturally, and professionally. That's not disrespect, it's math. And the union's strategy completely ignored that reality. They escalated pressure as if everyone was equally dependent on the system. They spoke about collective leverage while ignoring individual leverage. And in doing so, they revealed the blind spot that could cost them everything. Stephen A. wasn't defending Clark as a person. He was defending reality. You can't threaten shutdowns, lockouts, and instability while assuming your most valuable asset will simply wait patiently and absorb the damage. That's not how stars operate. Especially not stars who already cashed their biggest checks elsewhere. And here's where his commentary turned ominous. He warned that silence doesn't always mean compliance. Sometimes it means preparation. Sometimes it means detachment. Sometimes it means someone is already emotionally gone. They just haven't told you yet. Clark didn't respond to the union rhetoric. She didn't debate veterans publicly. She didn't insert herself into negotiations. She just stepped away. And that's when Stephen A. essentially said the quiet part out loud. If the league shuts down, Caitlin Clark won't feel it. If the season stalls, Caitlin Clark won't suffer. If negotiations drag on, Caitlin Clark won't beg. She'll move on. Broadcasting, brand expansion, overseas opportunities, independent ventures, options everywhere. Stephen A's message wasn't that Clark hates the WNBA. It was that she no longer needs it, and need is the foundation of leverage. Once that foundation cracks, everything else becomes unstable. And while the union believed they were tightening the screws on ownership, Stephen A made it painfully clear they were actually loosening their grip on the one player holding the entire structure together. But the real confirmation didn't come from his words alone. It came from what Caitlin Clark did next. A decision so quiet, so subtle, that most people missed its meaning entirely. Yet it may end up being the loudest statement she's ever made. Because when the money came calling, when the spotlight was guaranteed, when the offer was tailor-made for her, she said no. And that's where the panic truly began. This is the moment that turned private anxiety into full-blown panic, even though most fans barely noticed it when it happened. Because on the surface, Caitlin Clark turning down a side league doesn't sound earth-shattering. Players decline opportunities all the time. Schedules don't line up. Bodies need rest. Priorities shift. That's the easy explanation. But Stephen A. Smith made it clear, this wasn't just any offer. This was the offer. Unrivaled wasn't built as a passion project. It was engineered as a pressure valve for the WNBA, a way to keep star players visible, profitable, and marketable during the off-season without losing them to overseas leagues. It was founded by veterans who understood the business side of basketball and wanted more control, more equity, and more long-term power. And most importantly, it needed Caitlin Clark. Insiders believed her participation would legitimize the entire league overnight. Television negotiations hinged on it. Sponsorship projections were modeled around it. Media partners were waiting to see whether her name would be attached before committing serious money. This wasn't just about filling rosters. It was about building an ecosystem. So when Clark was approached, the pitch wasn't subtle. The reported offer checked every box players dream about. Short commitment, massive payday, ownership equity, creative control, red carpet treatment, a setup designed to make saying yes almost automatic, especially in a sport where athletes have historically been forced to grind year-round just to stay financially afloat. For most players, this would have been a no-brainer. For Caitlin Clark, it was something else entirely. Stephen A. framed her rejection as the clearest signal, yet that she was distancing herself not just from one league, but from the entire internal power structure of women's basketball. Because saying no to Unrivaled wasn't just declining money. It was declining relevance on their terms. It was refusing to lend her brand to a system that, in her eyes, had already taken more than it gave. And she didn't need to explain herself. The decision explained everything. Instead of chasing exposure, Clark chose absence. Instead of adding more appearances, she chose rest. Instead of reinforcing their leverage, she removed it. Stephen A. described it as a silent power move that cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. Because it forced everyone involved to confront a terrifying question. What if Caitlin Clark doesn't need to be everywhere anymore? Unrivaled needed her to attract viewers. Networks needed her to justify deals. Sponsors needed her to anchor campaigns. But she didn't need Unrivaled. She chose to play golf. She chose to step away from the noise. She chose to preserve her body and mind. And in doing so, she sent a message that rippled through every boardroom connected to the sport. This wasn't about rejecting teammates or veterans. It was about rejecting dependency. Stephen A. pointed out that this decision stripped away the illusion of collective power. Because the moment Clark withheld her participation, it exposed how much of the attention economy revolved around her specifically. Rumors immediately began circulating that broadcast packages were reconsidered, that projected viewership numbers were revised downward, that the league's entire valuation model shifted, quietly but significantly. And here's the part that made the rejection sting even more. Unrivaled was founded by players who had been vocal critics of how Clark was treated in the media, yet also benefited from the spotlight she brought. The tension wasn't personal. It was structural. Clark didn't attack anyone. She didn't call anyone out. She didn't stir drama. She simply declined to participate. And Stephen A. understood exactly how devastating that was. Because when the most valuable person in the room stops showing up, everyone else is forced to confront their real influence. This rejection didn't just cost Unrivaled money. It cost them credibility. It signaled to networks that even with star founders, the product might not move the needle without Clark's presence. And that realization bled back into the WNBA. If Clark could step away from a shiny new league with equity and money on the table, what would stop her from stepping away from a league embroiled in labor disputes, public resentment, and growing instability? Stephen A. made it clear. This was the moment where whispers turned into warnings. Because this wasn't defiance. This was detachment. And detachment is the last phase before departure. The union thought they were applying pressure. Unrivaled thought they were offering opportunity. But Clark showed them both the same thing. She doesn't need either. And that's when the golden goose problem stopped being a metaphor and started becoming a crisis. Because when the goose stops laying eggs, everyone else starts panicking. And that panic exposed contradictions no one wanted to confront. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped being polite and started being painfully honest, because at this point, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. He framed the entire situation with one analogy that instantly cut through the noise: the golden goose. And once you understand that metaphor, everything about the WNBA's current crisis becomes disturbingly clear. Caitlin Clark isn't just another player. She isn't just a rookie. She isn't just a high scorer or a media darling. She is the economic engine driving unprecedented attention into a league that had been fighting for relevance for nearly 3 decades. And yet, instead of protecting that engine, the system around her has been doing something far more self-destructive. They've been pecking at it. Stephen A. pointed out the hypocrisy with brutal clarity. On one hand, players and union voices demand revenue sharing, equity, and recognition tied to the explosion of interest in the league. On the other hand, those same voices minimize, dismiss, or outright resent the very player responsible for that explosion. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand Caitlin Clark money while treating Caitlin Clark like an inconvenience. And the evidence of that contradiction has been hiding in plain sight all season. Hard fouls that cross the line from physical to personal. Cold shoulders in locker rooms. Side eyes in press conferences. Subtle dismissals in media appearances. And perhaps most glaring of all, exclusion from elite opportunities that are supposed to reflect merit and impact. Stephen A. didn't dance around it. He called it what it looked like: jealousy mixed with denial. Not jealousy of her talent, but jealousy of her gravity. Because Clark didn't just raise her own profile. She raised ticket prices. She raised television ratings. She raised sponsorship value. She raised the visibility of players who had been grinding in relative obscurity for years. And instead of embracing that reality, parts of the ecosystem reacted defensively. Stephen A. described it as trying to squeeze golden eggs out of the goose while simultaneously preparing it for dinner. They wanted the benefits without the acknowledgement. They wanted the money without the discomfort of admitting where it came from. And the union's opt-out made that contradiction louder than ever. By escalating labor demands at the exact moment when Clark was absorbing the brunt of physical play and media scrutiny, they sent a message, intentional or not, that she was expected to carry the load indefinitely. No protection, no buffer, no appreciation, just expectation. Stephen A. argued that this is not how successful leagues operate. In any business, when one person generates a disproportionate amount of revenue, the system adapts around them. It doesn't pretend the contribution is evenly distributed. It doesn't punish success. It reinforces it. The NBA didn't survive the 1980s by pretending Larry Bird and Magic Johnson were interchangeable with everyone else. They leaned into them. They marketed them aggressively. They protected them. The WNBA, according to Stephen A., did the opposite. They allowed resentment narratives to grow unchecked. They allowed discourse to turn hostile. They allowed players to frame Clark's popularity as something that needed to be balanced rather than maximized. And that created a hostile environment for the one person they could least afford to alienate. Stephen A. emphasized that Caitlin Clark didn't demand this attention. She earned it. And punishing her for that reality is a failure of leadership, not a moral stance. The union wants fairness, and fairness matters. But fairness doesn't mean ignoring reality. Reality is that without Clark, the league doesn't look the same. It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't sell the same. And when the golden goose starts noticing that it's being blamed for laying too many eggs, it eventually stops laying them all together. Stephen A. warned that this mindset doesn't just hurt Clark. It hurts every player who depends on league stability to pay their bills. Because if the engine stalls, the entire system grinds to a halt. The contradiction is simple, and that's what makes it so dangerous. They need her, but they don't treat her like it. And that gap between dependence and resentment is what pushes stars away. Caitlin Clark didn't lash out. She didn't retaliate. She didn't escalate publicly. She did something far more alarming. She stepped back. And once that happens, the numbers start telling a story that feelings can't override. Because the math doesn't care about resentment. And when Stephen A. started laying out the numbers, the situation stopped being emotional and started being existential. This is where Stephen A. Smith completely removed emotion from the conversation and replaced it with something far more unforgiving. Numbers. Because feelings can be debated. Narratives can be spun. But math doesn't care who's offended. Stephen A. made one thing brutally clear. The WNBA Players Association is negotiating as if everyone in the league is equally dependent on the outcome. And that assumption collapses the moment Caitlin Clark enters the equation. The average WNBA player needs this CBA raise. They need higher salaries. They need better benefits. They need financial security so they don't have to fly overseas every offseason just to survive. That reality is real, and Stephen A. didn't dismiss it. But Caitlin Clark doesn't live in that reality. Her WNBA salary, even with bonuses and increases, represents a microscopic fraction of her annual income. It's symbolic. It's not structural. It's not life-altering. Stephen A. broke this down with uncomfortable clarity. Nike, major beverage brands, insurance commercials, global sponsorships, merchandise sales that dwarf most team revenues. Clark's financial ecosystem exists outside the league. That's the leverage imbalance the union refuses to confront. Because in a lockout scenario, the pain isn't shared equally. When games stop, most players lose their primary income stream. Caitlin Clark doesn't. If the season stalls, endorsement checks still clear. If negotiations drag, brand campaigns still run. If the league shuts down, her relevance doesn't. Stephen A. emphasized that this makes her the only player in the league who can walk away from the table without flinching, and that reality fundamentally breaks the union's bargaining position. They're threatening disruption in a system where the most valuable piece is immune to disruption. That's not leverage. That's self-sabotage. And here's the part that made Stephen A. visibly frustrated. The union is behaving as if Clark owes them participation, as if her presence is guaranteed, as if she'll absorb any amount of instability because it benefits the collective. But that assumption ignores the basic truth of modern sports economics. Stars don't subsidize systems that work against them. Stephen A. argued that Clark's endorsement deals didn't just enrich her, they lifted the entire league. Sponsors came because of her. Media coverage expanded because of her. Ticket prices rose because of her. Yet when it came time to acknowledge that reality, the narrative shifted toward minimizing her impact in the name of fairness. And that's where the math becomes fatal. Because fairness rhetoric doesn't pay bills. Revenue does. If Clark disappears, even temporarily, networks reassess. Advertisers hesitate. Sponsors renegotiate. And the revenue pool the union is fighting over shrinks dramatically. Stephen A. pointed out the irony. The union is demanding a bigger slice of a pie that only exists at its current size because of one person they refuse to fully embrace. And Caitlin Clark knows this. That's why she's not posturing. That's why she's not threatening. That's why she's not arguing publicly. She doesn't need to. Her leverage is passive. Every moment she chooses not to participate reminds everyone how much attention follows her absence. Every deal she turns down recalibrates valuations. Every step back increases pressure on the system. Stephen A. framed it as a quiet standoff, and one side doesn't even realize it's already losing. Because when negotiations turn hostile, the side that can afford to wait always wins. And Caitlin Clark can wait forever. The union, however, can't. They need games. They need checks. They need momentum. And by escalating conflict while assuming Clark will stay locked in, they're gambling with the only variable they can't control. That's why Stephen A. warned this wasn't just a labor dispute, it was a misread of power. And once leadership failures enter the equation, the situation goes from risky to reckless. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened under the watch of a league that failed to protect its most valuable asset. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped aiming at the players and turned his fire directly toward the top, because in his eyes, the biggest failure didn't belong to the union or the veterans. It belonged to leadership. In any serious business, there is one non-negotiable rule. You protect the asset that generates the revenue. Not emotionally. Not politically. Structurally. Stephen A. argued that the WNBA leadership violated that rule at every possible level. They watched the tension build. They heard the whispers. They saw the hostility forming in real time. And they did nothing. Instead of stepping in early and setting boundaries, they allowed resentment narratives to metastasize. They allowed on-court aggression to blur into something personal. They allowed media framing to turn Caitlin Clark into a lightning rod rather than a league ambassador. Stephen A. compared it to a company watching its top salesperson generate 80% of revenue, while coworkers openly undermine them and management shrugs. That's not neutrality. That's negligence. The league had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to stabilize, grow, and professionalize its product at warp speed. Clark's arrival wasn't just a basketball moment, it was a business inflection point. And instead of insulating her from internal friction, leadership let her absorb it. No public messaging reinforcing her value. No internal standards about treatment. No clear acknowledgement of the financial reality. Just silence. Stephen A. emphasized that silence from leadership is never neutral. It's permission. Permission for resentment to grow. Permission for lines to be crossed. Permission for the environment to become hostile. And that environment matters, especially for a player who didn't grow up needing to pay dues in the same way veterans did. Clark entered a league still negotiating its own identity, and leadership failed to guide that transition. They tried to keep everyone comfortable, and in doing so, they protected no one. Stephen A. called it a management disaster, hiding behind progressive language. Because while the league talked about growth, inclusivity, and opportunity, they failed to confront the uncomfortable truth that growth creates hierarchy. Someone benefits more. Someone carries more weight. And pretending otherwise doesn't make it fair. It makes it fragile. The leadership didn't want to be accused of favoritism. They didn't want backlash. They didn't want internal conflict. So they chose inaction. And inaction allowed the situation to rot. Stephen A. warned that if the league enters a lockout or strike, executives won't be able to blame players alone. They'll have to explain to sponsors, partners, and the NBA board why $1 billion opportunity slipped through their fingers. Not because fans weren't interested. Not because the product wasn't exciting, but because leadership refused to manage success. And the most dangerous consequence of that failure? They pushed their most valuable player toward emotional detachment. Because when athletes feel unsupported, misunderstood, or used, they don't always explode. Sometimes they withdraw. They stop investing emotionally. They stop defending the system. They stop seeing the league as home. Stephen A. hinted that Clark's distance isn't accidental. It's a response. A response to being treated like a resource rather than a person. A response to being asked to carry growth without protection. A response to leadership that wanted her impact without the responsibility that comes with it. And once that emotional cord snaps, no contract can fix it. Which brings the conversation to a darker, quieter dimension. One that doesn't show up on balance sheets or ratings charts. Because even the most valuable asset has limits. And Stephen A. made it clear. Caitlin Clark looked exhausted long before she stepped away. This is the part of the story that doesn't show up in box scores, endorsement reports, or labor negotiations, but it may be the most important of all. Because Stephen A. Smith wasn't just talking about money or power. He was talking about wear and tear. Not physical fatigue. Mental fatigue. All season long, Caitlin Clark was under a microscope. Every movement dissected. Every expression analyzed. Every interaction turned into a storyline. Cameras lingered on her body language. Social media froze frames of her reactions. Commentators speculated about her mood, her relationships, her teammates. That kind of attention doesn't feel flattering after a while. It feels invasive. Stephen A. suggested that by the end of the season, Clark wasn't just tired, she was emotionally drained. And that matters, because burnout doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like detachment. Sometimes it looks like someone quietly deciding they don't want to fight anymore. Not because they can't, because they don't have to. Clark didn't melt down publicly. She didn't complain. She didn't lash out. She stepped back. She went home. She played golf. She spent time with people who knew her before the noise. Stephen A. framed this not as avoidance, but as preservation. Because Clark sees what's coming. She sees a labor war brewing. She sees tension hardening into resentment. She sees the league sharpening its knives for negotiations, and she chose to remove herself from the blast zone. That decision alone terrified executives. Because when someone realizes they're happier outside the system than inside it, the threat of permanent departure becomes real. Stephen A. compared it to elite athletes who walked away early. Not because they lost love for the game, but because the environment poisoned the experience. The lesson is simple: money can't fix misery. And Clark already has the money. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. If the WNBA became a source of stress rather than fulfillment, she has no financial reason to endure it. And once that door opens psychologically, it's impossible to close. Stephen A. pointed out that Clark's silence is not indifference, it's clarity. She's evaluating whether continued participation makes sense. And every day the league remains unstable, that calculation shifts further away from loyalty. Burnout doesn't announce itself. It creeps in. It convinces you that peace is worth more than applause. And Clark has tasted peace. That's why Stephen A. warned that the league is playing with fire. Because if she realizes her life improves without the WNBA, the entire ecosystem loses its anchor. And the most terrifying part? She doesn't even need basketball to stay relevant. Which leads directly into the escape route no one wants to discuss publicly, but everyone behind the scenes is preparing for. Because the WNBA is no longer the only stage available. This is the part of the conversation that makes executives shift in their chairs. Because once it enters the picture, all domestic leverage disappears. Stephen A. Smith didn't spell it out dramatically. He didn't need to. Anyone who understands modern sports economics already knows the truth. Caitlin Clark isn't just a WNBA player anymore. She's a global asset. And globalization changes everything. For decades, overseas basketball was treated as a fallback, a place players went out of necessity, not choice. Long seasons, grueling travel, physical wear, cultural adjustments. It was survival money, not leverage money. That's no longer the case. Stephen A. hinted at what insiders have been whispering for months. International markets are watching Caitlin Clark closely. European clubs, Asian exhibition circuits, global sponsors looking for crossover stars who can sell out arenas for one-night events. Not seasons, not contracts, appearances. And the money attached to those appearances is staggering. Stephen A. framed it as a nightmare scenario for the WNBA. Because if the league enters a lockout, Clark doesn't lose opportunity. She gains flexibility. She could play limited games. She could tour major cities. She could make more in a month than the average WNBA player earns in years. London, Paris, Tokyo, Shanghai. The Caitlin Clark Global Tour isn't fantasy. It's a business model. And that's what terrifies the union's strategy. Because the moment Clark steps outside the WNBA ecosystem, the league loses control of her narrative, her availability, and her value. Stephen A. emphasized that global brands don't care about domestic labor disputes. They care about reach. And Clark's reach is no longer confined to American television ratings. She's recognizable. She's marketable. She's portable. That portability destroys leverage. If the WNBA shuts down, the union loses paychecks. If the WNBA shuts down, executives lose partners. If the WNBA shuts down, fans lose momentum. But Clark, she gains optionality. Stephen A. made it clear that this is the mistake being made in real time, treating the WNBA as the only platform that matters. That was true once. It isn't anymore. The league used to be the gateway. Now it's just one option. And when a star realizes that, the power dynamic flips completely. This is why the unrivaled rejection mattered. This is why the silence matters. This is why the step back matters. Clark is positioning herself above the chaos. Not as an act of rebellion, but as self-preservation. Stephen A. hinted that league officials know this. That's why there's panic behind the scenes. That's why messaging has become defensive. That's why negotiations feel rushed and reactive. They know once Clark proves she can thrive without the WNBA, the league becomes dependent on her goodwill, not the other way around. And goodwill evaporates in toxic environments. The union thought they were escalating pressure. Leadership thought they were staying neutral. But Clark has been quietly building an exit ramp that doesn't require drama, explanation, or permission. And once that exit exists, even the threat of instability becomes dangerous. Because stars don't threaten. They leave. And that realization brings us to the union's fatal miscalculation. the moment where strategy crossed into self-destruction. This is where Stephen A. Smith made it clear that the biggest mistake wasn't what the union did, it was when they did it. Because timing isn't just important in business. It's everything. The WNBA Players Association didn't opt out of the CBA quietly or cautiously. They did it boldly, confidently, and early, 2 full years ahead of schedule. And on the surface, that looked like strength. Ratings were peaking. Arenas were selling out. Media attention was finally mainstream. Corporate money was flowing in. To the union, this felt like the perfect moment to strike. But Stephen A. pointed out the fear hiding underneath that confidence. They were afraid the moment wouldn't last. They saw the spike. They felt the buzz. And instead of assuming it would compound over time, they treated it like a narrow window that had to be exploited immediately. That fear shaped everything. Because opting out early isn't just about leverage, it's about distrust. It signals that you don't believe stability is coming, that you don't trust momentum to sustain itself, that you're worried the hype might cool before the money fully arrives. Stephen A. described it as trying to cash in before the check clears. And that mindset is dangerous. The union assumed the fanbase was now loyal to the league itself, not to any single player. They assumed casual viewers were here to stay, regardless of drama. They assumed disruption wouldn't scare anyone away. That assumption is where everything starts to unravel. Casual fans don't follow labor battles. They don't read CBA breakdowns. They don't pick sides. They leave. Stephen A. emphasized that this is the most fragile phase of growth. The phase where new fans are still forming habits. Interrupt that process, and the habits never form. And the union chose to introduce instability at the worst possible moment. Instead of allowing the Caitlin Clark era to mature into long-term loyalty, they injected uncertainty. Instead of building trust with partners, they signaled risk. Instead of projecting unity, they exposed division. And all of that happened while their most important asset was already emotionally stepping back. That's the part Stephen A. kept circling back to. The union made a high-risk move assuming Clark would remain fully engaged, fully present, and fully committed to weathering the storm with them. But she never agreed to that. She didn't sign up to be a shield. She didn't volunteer to absorb chaos. She didn't promise loyalty through instability. And because she doesn't need the league financially, she has no incentive to stay inside a volatile system. Stephen A. pointed out that the union is negotiating as if this were a closed ecosystem, as if all players are trapped inside the same box. They aren't. Clark's box has an open door. And the moment instability rises, people with open doors leave first. This is why Stephen A. warned that public opinion may not break the way the union expects. If games are missed, if seasons are delayed, if momentum stalls, fans won't blame abstract systems. They'll blame whoever they believe caused the interruption. And if the narrative becomes that the union drove the most popular player in the sport toward disengagement, sympathy will be limited, especially when millions of fans tuned in because of her. Stephen A. wasn't predicting backlash, he was predicting indifference. And indifference is far worse. Because leagues don't survive on principle. They survive on attention. And attention is already shifting. Clark has shown she can remain relevant without playing. She's already proven it. She stayed in the headlines by saying no. She dominated discourse by doing less. The union, meanwhile, needs games to stay visible. Needs courts. Needs broadcasts. That imbalance is the miscalculation. They escalated pressure at the exact moment their leverage was weakest, because the person who matters most doesn't share their urgency. And that leads to the final, quiet truth Stephen A. kept hinting at. This isn't a negotiation anymore. It's a waiting game, and only one side can afford to wait. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped framing the situation as a debate and started framing it as an inevitability. Because once all the pieces are on the board, the outcome becomes obvious. The union escalated. Leadership hesitated. The ecosystem fractured. And Caitlin Clark? She went quiet. Stephen A. made it clear that silence, in this context, isn't uncertainty, it's leverage. It's the most powerful position anyone can hold in a system addicted to attention. Clark doesn't need to threaten departure. She doesn't need to hint at retirement. She doesn't need to demand concessions. All she has to do is nothing. Every week she stays disengaged, the pressure compounds. Every opportunity she declines, the imbalance becomes clearer. Every moment she remains relevant without stepping on a WNBA court proves the same uncomfortable truth. The league needs her more than she needs the league. Stephen A. described it as checkmate without a final move, because there's no counterplay available that doesn't involve risk. If the league pushes harder, it risks alienating her permanently. If it backs off too much, it exposes how dependent it truly is. The union is trapped by urgency. Leadership is trapped by optics. Media partners are trapped by uncertainty. Clark isn't trapped at all. That's why Stephen A. warned that this situation may never end with a formal resignation. It may never come with a headline announcement or an emotional goodbye. It may end the way it's unfolding now, quietly. A missed off-season appearance. A reduced schedule. A longer break than expected. A gradual shift toward other platforms. And suddenly, the league wakes up one day and realizes the center of gravity has moved. Not because Caitlin Clark was pushed out, but because she chose peace over pressure. Stephen A.'s most ominous point wasn't about money or ratings, it was about realization. Once someone understands their value and sees that the system around them is unstable, they don't rush back into chaos. They wait. They watch. And if conditions don't improve, they pivot permanently. The eject button doesn't need to be slammed. Sometimes it's pressed gently. And the scariest part for the WNBA? Clark has already shown she can press it without losing anything. So here's the reality, Stephen A. Smith was really confirming. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. This isn't a standoff between players and owners. This isn't just a labor dispute. This is a test of whether the WNBA understands the moment it's living in. Because stars like Caitlin Clark don't threaten systems. They outgrow them. And once that happens, no contract, no negotiation, and no public campaign can put the genie back in the bottle. The league still has time. The union still has options. Leadership can still intervene. But the silence keeps growing. And silence, in moments like this, isn't empty. It's loaded. If you want to understand what happens next, before the headlines spin it, before narratives get rewritten, and before the truth gets softened, this is where you stay locked in. Subscribe now, because when this story moves again, it won't be loud. It'll be final.